Good morning and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here. Today, as we continue to reflect on the long 2020 election season, we turn our attention to the issue of voting rights, an issue around which members of this congregation of St. Bart's have mobilized before, especially in this past year. And we're very happy to have with us today Perry Grossman, who is Senior Staff Attorney in the Voting Rights Project at the New York Civil Liberties Union, which is an affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. At NYCLU, he leads the organization's efforts to protect voting rights through litigation, legislative advocacy, and public education. He has served as the organization's lead counsel in matters before federal district and circuit courts, as well as the United States Supreme Court, including a recent challenge to putting a citizenship question on the census. He serves as adjunct professor at Fordham Law School and an occasional contributor to Slate on legal issues. Thank you so much, Perry, for being with us this morning.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's really such a pleasure to be here. So first of all, thanks to everybody who's watching. It really is such a pleasure to be here with you this morning and to be able to talk to you a little bit about this issue that really touches all of our lives and communities. The struggle for voting rights is one that's been ongoing since the founding of the Republic, and it continues very, very much today. And of course, as with almost everything, 2020 was a pretty wild year for voting rights, and the pandemic really brought on a huge number of challenges and innovations to come with it. We saw states, including New York, really try and expand access to voting by mail and to early voting. A wide range of measures to try and make voting safer and more convenient. And then we also saw massive resistance to those efforts, particularly in places like Wisconsin and Georgia, where there were lawsuits to try and prevent voting by mail and prevent early voting and prevent innovations like curbside voting and drive-through voting, right? Things that election officials really sort of racked their brains to try and make access to the franchise as safe and effective as possible. And it was quite the struggle, quite the frustration to have to fight that at every turn. More recently, we saw in the past few months, in spite of all of that voter suppression, the highest turnout in any election in United States history. And then in the Georgia runoff election that occurred shortly thereafter, more Black Americans casting ballots in an election than in any other in the history of that state. So clearly there is a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of drive for people to take ownership of our democracy and to be active participants in it. And the question is, where do we fit into all of this right now? What can we look forward to in 2021 and the coming years? And also to sort of look back and see how 2020 changed our frame of reference. One of the things I think we all saw was just these wild lawsuits taking place all over the country, trying to overturn election results. And that they failed almost universally is not evidence of anything except that these are some of the craziest things I have ever seen brought in front of a court. But my concern is that has perhaps put the country's frame of reference in a more anti-democratic, small d posture, because it has allowed for this idea to creep into the public consciousness that we can just overturn election results if we just have the right procedures in place, and that we can overturn the will of the people and ignore votes, which is absolutely, of course, not the way a functioning democracy works. And so we all have to be very much on guard right now for looking at, one, how do we stop those anti-democratic impulses? And two, how do we continue the work of making sure that people have ready and easy access to the franchise, that we are consistently expanding voter education so that people who have been historically marginalized from the system, denied the right to vote, are even more able to participate than ever before. To give just a very, very quick history lesson, because the phrase voter suppression comes up so often, obviously, if you go back to the U.S. Constitution, the right to vote is actually not found anywhere expressly. It is only found in the negative. We only see in the U.S. Constitution protections for equal access to the right to vote on the basis of race and on the basis of sex and on the basis of age. But it has been a struggle at every single turn to really actualize those protections. And so, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is one of the most powerful tools we've seen. And before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we saw what we call first generation barriers to the right to vote, right? And vote suppression is one term for them. Vote denial is perhaps a better way of thinking it, right? How do I stop people I don't want voting from casting a ballot? Whether it is poll taxes, literacy tests, making people guess the number of jelly beans in a jar on a desk at the polling place, right? Or old-fashioned voter intimidation. I mean, physical threats, all this stuff. And the Voting Rights Act really went a long way towards blocking a lot of those first-generation barriers. But the perpetrators of discrimination innovate as they always do. And we saw the second generation, which we know of as vote dilution. And that's actually going to be a really important concept over the next few years as we begin redistricting. Things like racial gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering. How do we, as a discriminatory government, want to allow people to go cast their ballots, but then make sure they don't count, right? That's the mindset of the vote suppressor, of the vote diluter, is how do I most effectively deny the will of the people so that we're able to maintain power for the folks that we are seeking to maintain power for. And so we've seen a lot of innovations in the law to tackle racial gerrymandering, to tackle partisan gerrymandering, but they remain a constant problem because conservative courts, and we've seen a massive rush by the Trump administration and by their allies in Congress to confirm, hundreds of new judges, including 3 Supreme Court judges who take a fairly dim view of voting rights. How do we operate in an environment where the federal courts have largely been fairly hostile to attacking vote suppression, to attacking vote dilution? And how do we confront these new barriers? And of course, along the way, we've seen evolved first generation barriers pop up. We don't have literacy tests anymore. We don't have guessing the number of jelly beans in the jar. We do have strict voter ID requirements in some states. We do have the contraction of early voting. We have all kinds of tweaks that government can do to make voting more difficult, right? And so when we think of vote suppression, think about anything that makes it harder for you to go and cast a ballot, right? And that can occur at any stage of the process, from registering to vote and eligibility requirements, from making sure that your registration is actually processed and added to the rolls, whether it stays on the rolls. You might hear about voter purges. That's another form of vote suppression. To actually the process of voting itself. Do I have access to a convenient polling place? Do I have access to voting by mail? If I go vote, am I going to face a very long line? If I go vote, am I going to have somebody at the polls who speaks my language and is able to help me actually get my ballot counted? And then even on the back end, once you've actually cast your ballot, there may be opportunities for your vote to be challenged and thrown out. Those are other forms of vote suppression. So there's a lot to be vigilant about. And here in New York, we have to be especially vigilant for 2 reasons. One, even though we think about vote suppression as something that occurs largely in the Jim Crow South and the Confederacy and these awful, states where we see splashed all over the news, the long lines of the polls and that stuff. Well, that's us too. We are not exempt from any of this. We have a bad history of discrimination. We have a bad history of political machines, right, dating back to Tammany Hall and whatnot, trying to make it difficult for people they don't want to vote actually casting their ballots. So we have to be vigilant because of our own bad history. But we also owe the rest of the country an important responsibility, which is progressive states, and I say that with a little bit of hesitancy about New York sometimes, because we're not always as progressive as we could be, but progressive states have to fight back and move the frame of reference towards a more small d democratic society. As we see states like Kentucky and Texas and Alabama, trying to make it harder to vote and shifting the public consciousness in a way that makes people think it is acceptable to suppress votes, that it's acceptable to dilute votes. Blue states, progressive states, California, New York, Vermont, Illinois, Maryland, I could do this for a while, have a responsibility to push the conversation in the other way. How do we set a good example? How do we make it easier for people to register and vote? How do we make sure that we are closing the gap and making it more equitable so that we do not see huge racial differences in registration and turnout rates, so that people of color are equally able to participate in the political process and to elect their candidates of choice? And so here in New York, in the past 2 years, we've actually seen some important innovations. Previously, we didn't have early voting, we didn't have electronic registration, we didn't have all of these very simple things. And in court cases in Ohio and North Carolina, those states would actually point to New York and say, what are you getting on us for contracting early voting? New York doesn't even have early voting. What are you getting on us for not making registration or easily available? New York doesn't have that at all. And so we've got to go from being a bad example to being a very good example. And just the last thing I want to mention for the moment before hopefully we get into some questions is, we tend to think about these issues at the national level, at the federal level, right? We think about the race for president, we think about Senate races, congressional races, but most governing takes place at the state and local level, and it doesn't get as much attention. And we're going to see critical state races in 2022. We are going to see a new map drawn for our congressional districts, our state legislative districts, our city council districts, outside of New York City, county legislative districts. This is going to happen all over the country with these redistricting procedures taking place once the data comes from the Census Bureau, in the next 6 to 12 months. It's really important to remember that when all of this governing takes place at the local level and the state level, don't overlook them. Make sure that you're voting in local elections. Right here in New York City, we've got mayoral and city council elections coming up. In fact, I've got a special election coming up in March for my city council district. And so we want to make sure that we are doing what we can to educate our neighbors, motivate our neighbors to participate. I'm here in a nonpartisan capacity. Unfortunately, voting rights has become much of a partisan issue, but I'm not here advocating for any political party. It's important that we are always encouraging our neighbors to participate, that we are always going out of our way, because it strengthens our community, it strengthens our confidence in government, and our ability to accomplish those important challenges together. And so that's where I'm going to stop for a moment. Is as much as the cryptozoological lawsuits of November and December with their krakens and other sort of crazy references dominate the news, it is the city council elections, the school board elections, the DA races that have as much impact on our lives as any other, but don't get the most attention. So I want you to try and keep your focus there as well, and how voting rights is going to impact those as well as the things that we see on the news.
Thank you so much, Perry. Those of you who are watching and have questions for Perry, please send them in using the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org, pthompson@stbarts.org. Perry, you chose as the title for this session, Protecting the Right That Preserves All Others. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you mean by that. Why are voting rights so central to civil rights in general?
Oh, it's a great question. So I'm not going to take credit for that particular phrase. That actually comes out of a series of cases from what was called the Rights Revolution of the 1960s. I believe it's from a case called Reynolds v. Sims, or maybe Baker v. Carr. But right, the right to vote is the right that preserves all other rights, because it is the right that allows us to hold elected officials accountable for making sure that they are not infringing upon our other rights. When I do voter education work, frequently it is not easy to engage people on voting rights because it feels very abstract. But your access to voting rights impacts your ability to hold elected officials for the issues that you do feel in a primary way every day. If you are someone who cares deeply about education, your ability to impact education policy is profoundly affected by your ability to hold whoever is responsible for education policy accountable. So, if you're living in New York City where the schools are under mayoral control, your ability to go into a mayoral candidate forum and say, I am a voter, I care deeply about New York City's public schools, I want to know what you're going to do about it, and my vote depends on it. That is a strong statement. And so whether it is education or the environment or policing or parks or whatever it is, your ability to preserve and hold elected officials accountable for ensuring that those rights are preserved depends directly on your ability to cast an effective ballot.
Can you talk a bit about recent cases you've been involved in and what these kinds of cases are like to litigate?
Oh, sure. I will. I'll talk about two because they really do run the gamut. So, one case I was involved in, the Citizenship Question case, right, with the Secretary of Commerce, largely at the direction of the president, wanted to put a citizenship question on the 2020 decennial census. And, that contradicted generations of Census Bureau directors who had said, no, that's going to reduce response rates, particularly among immigrant groups and Hispanic groups, but communities of color in general. And, we acted quickly, the NYCLU with the ACLU and our partners at Arnold and Porter, our clients at groups like Make the Road New York, the New York Immigration Coalition. We filed a complaint against the federal government, and we got into the business very quickly of, getting documents from the federal government, really sifting through what it is that they'd relied on to make those decisions, to show that this was not about what they said it was about. They said, somewhat laughably for anyone who works in this field, that adding a citizenship question was about protecting, enforcing the Voting Rights Act. And when in fact, it was very clearly an effort to intimidate immigrants, to intimidate Hispanic citizens, Hispanic residents, mixed status households. And so, we were able to, again, go through thousands of government documents to find communications between the Secretary of Commerce and his aides showing that they just cooked up as a fake rationale the idea of enforcing the Voting Rights Act. And then we got those folks in a room and we deposed them one at a time, and we're able to expose that enforcing the Voting Rights Act was, of course, not their true rationale. They actually refused at any point to state what their true rationale was. We won in front of a district court. We got a lot of coverage for the case. We finally got our way up in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. My friend and colleague Dale Ho argued it for us and did a spectacular job. And by the narrowest of margins at the U.S. Supreme Court, we had a 5-4 majority that upheld the district court and said that the fact that the government never stated its true rationale for adding a citizenship question was enough to keep it off the census. And so, you know, it was litigated at a really breakneck pace, and we went up against a tough DOJ that was trying to hide documents and things at sort of every turn, but managed to progress our way through. And it's a big, obviously a big national case with a lot of coverage. On the other hand, I also litigated a case, which is still ongoing, against the East Ramapo Central School District. And that is a school board in Rockland County, New York. It's actually one of the 10 largest school districts in New York State. And it's deeply segregated. It's got about 10,000 public school students. They're 96% non-white. It's got about 30,000 private school students. They're about 99% white. And the school board is dominated by the preferred candidates of white voters, right? You have white voters voting one way and voters of color voting another way. And the preferred candidates of white voters invariably win every single election. And those public schools have been defunded over time. We saw public school buildings that were sold off at sweetheart deals to private schools. We saw the school board refuse state aid because they didn't want to give up any control. State aid that would have restored public school services. And so, we went to the school district and we sent them a demand letter and said, we're gonna sue you if you don't do this, and we don't switch to a single member system so that people of color are able to elect folks from their communities to help represent their interests. And they fought us for 3.5 years. It gets sporadic amounts of coverage. It's actually got a lot of coverage right now because a special election is actually going to happen this coming week, the first time under a fair map. But, the district spent, I think at this point, probably about $8 million of money that comes right out of the public school budget, trying to maintain this system that empowers white voters to dominate the school district, which allows them to dominate, who the superintendent is, what the school budget looks like, whether people from the community will get listened to, and whether their interests are going to be respected. Part of that, by the way, an important part of the political process is, how do candidates get endorsed and supported, right? If we look at partisan elections, which are, fairly common, the Democratic and Republican Party have a line on the ballot. Anybody can enroll in the Democratic or Republican Party just by checking a box on a voter registration form. It entitles you to vote in the primary. If you want to join different party committees to help pick the candidates who are going to find their way onto the ballot or get the party's endorsement, you can do that. In a school district where you don't have any political parties, the power vacuum gets filled up by nonpartisan groups and by leaders. And in East Ramapo, in the white community, there was a small group of religious leaders who were able to basically endorse a candidate and make sure that candidate did not have to campaign. They just won. And if you were a Black or Latinx citizen of East Ramapo, you couldn't participate in that process to help them pick a candidate. You couldn't necessarily go find your way to get an audience in front of them to be interviewed to seek their endorsement. It was a closed process, and that allowed the white community to not just dominate the school board elections, but to really keep it shielded from public view. And so in our case, again, a lot of documents, a lot of depositions, looking frankly at the private text messages of some of these school board members of the community to really suss out where the discrimination is. So it's a very intense process of discovery. We had a 6-week trial with 30 witnesses in front of Judge Kathy Seibel in the Southern District of New York up in White Plains. We got a favorable decision in May. The school district has continued to fight it. We had that decision affirmed by the Second Circuit just a few weeks ago. The school district is continuing to fight it. They asked the full court to review that decision, and they, may ask the Supreme Court to look at it at some point. But we do know that there is a special election ongoing now. It will close on February 2nd, and we will have a school board elected under a fair system for the first time because of that litigation.
Do you want to say anything more about the connection between voting rights and racial justice?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. Yes, I mean, voting rights is obviously it's an issue for all of us because all of us, have the opportunity and the obligation to participate in our democracy. But voting rights have been denied throughout the history of this country because of race. Voting rights have been a way to make sure that people of color simply have less access to political power than white people. And there's so many dimensions on which this occurs, so many jurisdictions in which this occurs, that it's there's just so much work to do. So whether it's school boards and giving people of color an opportunity to elect their candidates of choice, to make sure that there's someone looking out, someone accountable to them for making sure that their children's education is adequate, excellent, hopefully. That's a voting rights issue. It comes back to that concept of the right to vote being preservative of all other rights. If you don't have access to equal voting rights, you don't have equal access to hold elected officials accountable to ensure, economic justice, environmental justice, and obviously those all break down along racial lines as well, right? Racial justice is such an important umbrella term for all of these issues where we see racial inequity. And so, obviously before the 15th Amendment, the right to vote was not extended necessarily to people of color at all. And then, we saw 100 years of massive resistance through all kinds of vote denial schemes, again, including some which persist in New York today. We still have laws on the books about the disenfranchisement of people convicted of felonies, that hopefully will get undone finally right now. Those laws were enacted in order to keep Black people from voting. We had literacy tests here until the early 1960s even. And that was designed to prevent Latinx New Yorkers from exercising political power. And it is political power, it is the right to vote that ultimately allows, for racial justice on all of the different policy fronts in which we see it. It also just allows us to look our neighbors in the eye and be on equal footings as citizens within a democracy.
So we do have several questions coming in. The first question has to do with the ability to register to vote on Election Day. The questioner points out that in 19 states and in Washington, D.C., one has the ability to register to vote on Election Day. Would this be a helpful reform if implemented more broadly?
Excellent question. Yes, it would be a fantastic reform. Same day registration, Election Day registration, right? Because Election Day registration is obviously the ability to register on Election Day, but we also have early voting now, and so the ability to register anytime you go to vote would be really helpful. And so we found in social science research that the availability of same day registration and Election Day registration just offers a huge boost to turnout, frequently 5 to 8%. And so it would be great to introduce that everywhere. And the folks who tend to advocate against same day registration or access to the franchise say, well, anyone who isn't registered to vote isn't sufficiently engaged, or isn't really enough of an active citizen to be entitled to voting in our democracy, which is ridiculous. People get engaged close to Election Day because that's when campaigns ramp up. That's when news coverage ramps up. That is when candidate debates and forums. And so people are getting so much information at the last minute. Allowing them to register and vote at the same time is a critical innovation. In New York right now, our state constitution actually has a provision that requires you to be registered to vote at least 10 days before an election. Hopefully this year, we'll have an opportunity to undo that, which will allow for same-day registration. The New York State Senate has already passed, or at least the Elections Committee has already passed the next stage of that, and hopefully it'll be on the ballot for everybody this November. And hopefully we'll get implementing legislation along the way. I suspect this will be a theme of the rest of the conversation, but you should absolutely call your state legislators and let them know you want same-day registration now. It is a thing that we can absolutely make happen so that New York is the 20th state to do it. Hopefully every state does it. And if Congress wanted to intervene to make that happen, that would be fantastic. And that'd be an excellent use of congressional power.
Can you talk a little more about the importance of turnout? We had a question from someone who wonders if our politics, perhaps optimistically, if our politics become less inflamed and turnout is low, what is the impact on voting rights and also kind of on our political system? So
turnout, right? So turnout lends legitimacy to government, right? Government by the consent of the governed, right? That is what Republican democracy is. And, the more people who turn out to vote, the more confidence we have that the people who are elected to do the will of the electorate. And so, we want to see more turnout. We want to see more robust discussion of the issues. Just as a collateral matter, civic engagement on elections is good on civic engagement on other issues, right? People who are more likely to vote are also more likely to engage in other, positive civic behaviors, whether it's volunteering or paying their taxes, all kinds of other pro-social, pro-democratic, again, small d democratic activity. And so, we like seeing more participation. We do, of course, want to see less acrimony, and politics, to some extent, will always be a heated enterprise, right? Someone will win elections and someone will lose elections, and anytime you have that sort of competition, there will be some hostility. My hope, and that's sort of I think the hope of everybody, is that that fierce competitiveness that comes in elections, and I guess is ratcheted up the more people are engaged with it, that we are able to recognize our good faith differences of opinion when it comes to our candidates and our policy, and that we're able to agree on a number of important issues, including the legitimacy of everybody being able to vote, right? Certainly we should be able to disagree about what makes for the best economic policy, education policy, environmental policy. But we shouldn't have a difference of opinion about the goal of having everyone who is eligible to vote and wants to vote being able to vote. And that's where we currently have a really big difference of opinion. Right now, there are elected officials out there and leaders of one particular political party who understand that more voting is an existential threat to their party as it exists right now. That is not a good way to be. Again, speaking in my sort of professional, nonpartisan capacity, my hope is that parties would recognize that full turnout, maximum turnout is a good thing, and then compete for voters on the basis of really sound policy. I don't want to see Republicans giving up and saying, we've got to suppress votes to win. I would prefer to see them get out and try and say, look, you know what? We should go from 70% turnout to 90% turnout. And that 20%, that's an opportunity for us to bring in even more voters by selling them on our partisan worldview and our policy worldview. That's that competition of ideas, that marketplace of ideas. That's what we want to see happen. And so the very short answer, and I apologize for the long-winded one, is more turnout is better, more competition of ideas is better, and the ability to agree without being disagreeable, I think is something we all strive for in our politics, both nationally and personally, and hopefully it's something we can achieve eventually.
What is our best hope for comprehensive voting rights reform? Is it a new Voting Rights Act? Is it a constitutional amendment? Or are we kind of stuck with the piecemeal approach?
Very good question. So let me start by saying the best realistic hope for comprehensive voting rights reform are acts of the United States Congress. So to be just a little bit wonky for a second, there is a clause of the US Constitution, the Elections Clause, which gives Congress broad authority to regulate federal elections, right? We have federal elections every 2 years. There are, of course, elections that are not subject to that elections clause, right? State and local elections that don't touch federal elections in any way. But Congress can really act in order to raise the level of participation, to raise access to voting rights in a really meaningful way, just through legislation. And so, certainly restoring the Voting Rights Act as it was previously constituted is important. I'm happy to talk about that. That's, I think, an interesting topic that I get a little wonky on occasion, but a really good thing to have the crown jewel of the civil rights laws restored to its prior effectiveness. But the Congress can also do a lot of really important nuts and bolts election things in terms of automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration. Making access to voting by mail stronger, making the U.S. Postal Service's prioritization of delivering ballots more of a priority, right? I mean, one of the important things we saw is that voting rights can be so tied up with other important federal agencies and state agencies, and we want to make sure that they're all adequately have adequate funding and policy guidelines. So right now, I think there's an opportunity for the U.S. Congress to step in and make comprehensive national changes through legislation. But there's also a lot of opportunity at the state and local level. And so I think it was Justice Brandeis who many years ago referred to the states as laboratories of democracy, right? Because we see all these different state legislatures and local councils bubbling up good policy ideas. And right, so here in New York City for the first time, we have ranked choice voting. Interesting. I don't see the U.S. Congress implementing ranked choice voting on a national scale. And that makes sense, right? It's different ideas are going to work better in different places. And so we can advocate for positive changes that, and innovations that may work on our local level. And, personally, I can't imagine trying to vote in this upcoming mayoral election with 4,000 candidates if I wasn't able to rank my top 5. And if, we didn't have someone winning ultimately with, 50+% of the vote, instead of potentially someone coming out and just managing to eke by with 11% of the vote. But again, so I would say that it's important to be attuned to innovation at every level. And so again, to come back, comprehensive reform comes nationally from Congress and only Congress. And I think there are opportunities there. On a statewide level, right, our state legislatures are able to be really good laboratories of democracy as well. So passing things like same-day registration, improving access to online registration, more early voting sites, right? I mean, you can have Congress saying like, look, we'd like to see every state offer 15 days of early voting, but Congress can't tell you where you should put early voting sites necessarily. They don't know Manhattan or Syracuse or Essex County or, Oklahoma, right? So local councils really have to get involved. States have to really get involved in making sure that those fine details are paid attention to, because those fine details really matter. So I'll give you a very, very fast example about early voting, right? 2019, New York State enacts early voting for the first time, and they set a floor that says that you have to have at least 2 early voting sites for every 50,000 registered voters in the county. Okay. Rensselaer County, New York has 106,000 registered voters. That's 2 sites. Rensselaer County has 1 city of any meaningful size. It is Troy, New York. I think roughly 80% of every person, of people of color in Rensselaer County, live in Troy. The Board of Elections put neither early voting site in Troy, New York. And so that becomes a real problem. That is a form of voter suppression. You are deliberately trying to make access to early voting less convenient for communities of color. And so, it is incumbent upon us as New Yorkers. Congress is not going to step in and mandate an early voting site in Troy. The New York State Legislature, has to step in and adapt and say, okay, we're going to make sure that there is at least one early voting site in the most populous city in every county. Okay, that's an improvement. Rensselaer County responds, and they put an early voting site in Troy in the least convenient possible area. Okay, fine. What do we do next? Well, now we're talking about, certainly the state legislature can respond again and be like, okay, no, we have more strictures on early voting sites, and we're going to require that you put it, next to a major transportation hub, or, any number of things. But you also see local municipal policy potentially responding. We're going to provide free public transportation on election day, right? That would be a beneficial policy to get people to the polls. We're actually going to run shuttle buses from dense minority neighborhoods to this inconvenient polling place, right? So there's all kinds of things that we can constantly be experimenting with doing at any level of government, and that kind of experimentation, is obviously valuable to fighting voter suppression, like we're seeing in Rensselaer County, or to innovating in a positive way with ranked choice voting, like we're seeing here in New York City. We'll see it at the state level, with more innovations when it comes to same-day registration and absentee voting from there. And then again, hopefully Congress comes through with comprehensive reform and also restoring pre-clearance, which is what was rendered inoperable in the Shelby County decision back in 2013. Voting cases, especially vote dilution cases, are incredibly expensive and time-consuming to bring, right? I mentioned my East Ramapo case before. That's taken several years to litigate. It's cost the school district $8 million paying its own, high-priced Washington law firm to come in and lose repeatedly. It's cost myself and my co-counsel at Latham and Watkins millions and millions of dollars on our side to litigate it. That is all money that could be better spent educating children. And so the more we can prevent wasted money on litigation, the more we are putting that money to where it can be doing a useful job, whether it's education or environment, or et cetera, et cetera. And so what preclearance does is it says that anytime there are changes to election laws and practices, whether it's new redistricting plans or moving polling places or cutting back the number of early voting days or adding early voting days, those changes all get reviewed by the Attorney General's office, which signs off on them if they're non-discriminatory, and if they are discriminatory, rejects them. So manages to prevent states from making minority voters worse off without having to spend millions and millions of dollars in years in litigation. Getting that system back online is really important to voting rights equity in the South, and expanding it, I think, would be really useful to anywhere that wants to adopt it, because what we want is we want our election officials to be in the mindset of expanding access to the right to vote, right? Not how do we do the least possible, or how do we actively disenfranchise people who we don't want voting, but thinking that, okay, if we're not actually going out of our way to think about racial equity in voting and to think about increasing turnout generally, we're going to end up getting that plan sent back to us. So hopefully pre-clearance becomes operable again and improves our decision-making over time so that we're able to have better plans generally and less litigation.
There's some questions about the two-party system and specifically, the role of political independence and them not having a voice. Can you speak to any of those factors?
Sure. Right. So the two-party system is very much a feature of national politics. It's been the Democratic and Republican Party for a long time, although not always. And we have had in the past third parties pop up in an influential way, or independent candidates pop up in an influential way in national elections. And there are times when they've been really influential in the conversation. I mean, I think the last time we could talk about the 2016 election and the role of third parties there, but I'll step back to a little bit less contentious time, to 1992, which is the last time we had a very serious third party presidential candidate with Ross Perot. And so he and Admiral Stockdale added a lot to the conversation. Having more folks in the mix certainly broadens the number of policy perspectives, broadens the number of options. And so there is some real virtue to getting outside of the two-party system. The benefit, to some respect, of the two-party system, of course, is that you've got, at least hypothetically speaking, two very well organized turnout machines, voter education machines, candidate recruitment machines, that are able to turn out the most voters in U.S. history in the last election. Obviously, a lot of that is due to outside groups, racial justice groups, civic groups, and some unfortunate groups as well. But right, so the political parties serve an important function. Here in New York, we have a device, the fusion ballot, which actually probably better allows third parties to have influence over the political process than most. Right? Because you can have the cross endorsement of candidates. You can have, Joe Biden endorsed by the Democratic Party and the Working Families Party. You can have Donald Trump endorsed by the Republican Party and the Conservative Party. And voters can signal their policy preferences by voting, and say, oh, well, I'm a very conservative Republican. I'm going to vote for Trump on the Conservative Party line, or I'm a very liberal Democrat. I'm going to vote for Biden on the Working Families line, and that's a way to signal, some level of political independence. But the difficulty in a closed primary state like New York, right? So you can only vote in the primary election if you are an enrolled member of the political party, is that independents do get shut out in what is, at least in New York City, usually the only election that matters. So I live in the Bronx. There is no meaningful alternative to the Democratic Party, with the exception of occasionally the Working Families Party, in a lot of our elections here. And so that June primary is all that matters. And if you are a political independent, you are shut out. And so the benefit from a political science perspective of having a closed primary system is that the party stays, hypothetically at least, more ideologically coherent, more politically coherent, because they're able to exclude people who don't necessarily share their worldview, and it prevents what's called party raiding, which is what John Katzimatidis is trying to do by getting 1.6 million Republicans to register as Democrats and vote in the primary. But it also diminishes participation, because again, here's the only election that matters, and you're only allowed to vote in it if you're a Democrat. So there's really trade-offs in both directions in terms of what the two-party system means and what the closed primary system means, what the fusion ballot means, and so just from a again, from a political science rather than a partisan perspective, from a voting perspective, the two-party system is very simple. It's very sort of easy to bend your head around, but it prevents a lot of the nuance that would exist in politics from a more fragmented system. But it's also, certainly at the national level, difficult to integrate third parties in a very meaningful way without viewing them as sort of significant spoilers. And so, whether it's independent politics or third-party politics, is probably the kind of thing that best bubbles up at the local level first. Again, it's a good environment for innovation, and maybe at the state level, and working from there. So that's sort of the best take I have on it, is that the two-party system is very much what we have at the national level. It doesn't necessarily always need to be, but national elections are a very, very slow-moving boat. And so if, as political independents or as members of third parties, you are concerned about your ability to influence elections, much, much easier to make change at the state and local level than by trying to change politics at the national level.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to stop there. We're already over time. I wonder very quickly as we end if you might share 2 or 3 things you recommend we as individuals or as a congregation do to help protect and ensure voting rights.
Oh, great. Okay. So
quickly.
Yes, quickly. Okay. Vote, register to vote, vote, make sure everyone you know registers to vote, and then make sure everyone you don't know registers to vote. But also, don't be afraid to call your legislators. You have no idea how powerful you are, especially if you can organize a couple friends to do it as well. If you're able to get 10 people together to call a legislative office and demand they pass the New York Voting Rights Act or same-day registration or all kinds of good reforms, feel free to look on our website, nyclu.org. Feel free to look at the Let New York Vote Coalition for policy ideas and call your legislators and let them know that you want to see change.
Thank you so much, Perry. Thank you for getting up early on a Sunday morning to chat with us. And thank you for the important work that you're doing.
Thanks so much, Peter. Really appreciate your patience with me.
Of course. Thank you all for watching. Please join us for worship at 11 a.m.